Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast. I'm your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. The Designing Hollywood podcast is dedicated to all things movies, the movie industry, and its talented professionals. I want to thank our sponsor, Fox Studios Costumes. And our guest today is a costume designer born in Manchester and started her career at the Royal Exchange Theatre as a costume maker, then studied costume design at the Wimbledon School of Art in 1990 to 93. She was an assistant designer on films including Ridley Scott's Gladiator and Jake Scott's Plunkett McLean. She went on to design costumes for Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down. She received Costume Designers Guild Award nominations for Excellence in Period Film, The Imitation Game, and Excellence in Fantasy Films, Ex Machina, X-Men First Class, and V for Vendetta. Her more recent film credits include Assassin's Creed, directed by Justin Kurzel, Marvel's Ant-Man, Annihilation, and Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. Her latest anticipated film to be released in theaters is Marvel's Eternals, directed by Chloe Zhao. She is currently working on Marvel's Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Sammy Differ to the Designing Hollywood podcast. Sammy, I got to tell you, it's a great thrill to have you here. And I look at your credits and as a fan of science fiction, fantasy, and horror films, I look at your credits and I can only say what a delicious career you've had. I'm a huge fan of yours. And I think before we get into your career, I would love to start with just asking you your philosophy when you're given movies that have science fiction, fantasy, and horror bents to them. How do you start? I mean, obviously, you're creating costumes. You can't go and look at, what did Magneto wear as the real person? You know, I guess he is a historical figure. If you go back to the comics, you can go deep back into the '60s. But like, if you're gonna design something for like Assassin's Creed, which actually I guess you could go back into history, do you go and look at the source material first? Do you read the scripts? How do you begin the process?
I 100% read the script first. That's like your main source. And then I kind of research, depending on the period or modern or wherever it is, I'll kind of research if there is an indicated area to look in terms of period or, I don't know, tech or science. And then I will break things down into elements, really. I tend to kind of do an overview of kind of the feel of the film and colors and stuff, and obviously take on board what the director wants. And then taking each individual character, I try to break them down in a very elemental way. So you kind of use color and texture, and maybe there's a theme involved that you can bring some source material through. And it is my process is definitely very organic, which often drives some of my team a bit mad, because I kind of talk in very elemental ways about, texture and feel and color and stuff like that. So it's definitely built from the base step up, if you know what I mean. Yeah, it's a big journey. It's a big journey.
Well, now, when it comes to one of the things that's always fascinated me about costume design is, I've talked to a few costume designers now, and a lot of them say that they spend a lot of time in museums looking at paintings and getting a feel for fabrics and colors. Is that something that you find yourself doing a lot?
I think researching is yes, museums, books, the world, landscapes, each film, it has such a life of its own, that every time you set on a journey of research, it's a new version of that, which is what's so exciting about working in film and working in costume, is no two films are ever the same.
Right.
So you can make, you learn from the last film you've done. There might be new techniques you use all the time that take you a step further. But it's always, I treat each film as a new baby, and what we're going to write on the pages of that brain, that kind of thing. And it's I mean, that's why, yes, museums, yes, libraries, your own library. Sometimes it's just like walking down the street, it might be that you just need to go and sit in a cafe and watch people, or go to the beach and research. I mean, what's great about the internet is now we've got so much more source, and
Right.
you have to really take some of that research carefully so that it's not someone's view of it, that it might, whether it's truth or not, but yeah, I think I don't have any boundaries of where my research comes from. It could be I'll be inspired by a letter that comes through the post that's got a picture on it. That's happened once. Or just, somebody says something, or I'll wake up at 5 a.m. and write down, oh, I often have solutions to problematical tech parts of costumes at about 4, 5 a.m. in the morning. And I know if I go to sleep, wake up, I go, there it is. But, it might take weeks for that.
Well, I look at things that you started out. Obviously, one of your first credits as a costume designer was working for Ridley Scott. Now,
Yeah.
you had worked on, you can't see it, but I have a beautiful figure of Maximus from Gladiator up on my shelf back here. But you started out working for Ridley Scott, who's one of the most detail-oriented directors, and
Yeah.
and then you went from working on Gladiator to working with him on Black Hawk Down, and then you went. I find this curious. You did Canterbury Tales, Ancient Egyptians, and The Merchant of Venice. So you were steeped in history. You were going back into historical, and I wonder, like, when you're doing that, obviously nowadays historical epics, we must have such a backlog of places to source this material from. But do you like to work from scratch, or
Yes,
you do?
totally. Yeah, every time. I think because I started from a very young age, I started both interested in history and clothing, but not fashion. I was a bit
Interesting.
scared of fashion, and I knew when I left school that I didn't want to go and do like a university education in terms of subject. I wanted to be a designer, and I think oh, I've lost my thread for a minute there. Sorry.
You were scared of. I want to know why were you scared of fashion?
Because I don't know, and I still am. I don't know why, but I'm so comfortable with the way that I look at a character, read a character and look at it and go, okay, this is gonna be goat, cow, 15th century with, I don't know, bright pink, and put it together like a little, recipe and see what comes out. And I'm so comfortable with that anything fashion based, I'm a bit like, well, we'll go and buy it all, and you've got to style it, and then you kind of don't know the intention of the designer has made this thing and what the intention is. And of course it's all your own version of it, but I'm just not as comfortable with fashion as I am with history and fantasy and armor and techie stuff, and all those things that you can have sort of fun creating, and it's not necessarily fashionable. It doesn't have to be fashionable. I don't know. I'm probably saying the wrong thing about fashion, but even when I was 16 and I went to art college, I was like, the only thing you could do was a fashion design course. So I set myself on the course and went, can I just use a script? I'm going to do, I don't know, choose a play, and then made clothing based on that period. So for me, period research, I was so interested in. And then I was so lucky to get to work with the Royal Exchange Theatre when I was only 18, too young to get on a degree course. So I went to them and said, can I just work for you for nothing? And I was there for 4 weeks, just cleaning shoes and doing whatever. And it just happened to be their centenary year, and they were super busy, and they found out that I could sew. So they gave me a job as an apprentice. So I spent 4 years there and learned everything about, work for all the cutters, tailoring, not so much because that's really specific, but all the sort of, bone corsetry and making 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century stuff. So I had all that kind of wealth of research from me being interested, and then this learning it on the job. with actors and, dressing actors in the evening. So I got this whole education of how to be with actors and at a very, very young age. And then they said to me, "You're wasted here. You need to go and get a degree in costume design, set me some projects." And I got into Wimbledon.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was 23, and I think because I'd had so much before, I utilized the course really well because I kind of really understood what it was like from script, research, making, production in theatre, and it was rep. So it's a 4-week turnaround. So
Yeah.
for 4 years, I was doing every 4 weeks, and I was making and dressing the actors in the evening, then making in the day. So, doing like 8 till 11 at night, loved every minute of it. And then that's when I'd done my degree. Wimbledon is such an amazing place. A lot of the tutors there are working designers. So I was very fortunate to meet people like Hazel Pethig, Charles Node, John Bright, lots of others. And then I started working for a designer, David Blight, who I stayed with for a couple of years as his assistant. And then bumped into Janty Yates in a very kind of convoluted way,
Wow.
and I ended up her assistant for a few years. And so when she got Plunkett and Maclean, I was like, oh, I've done loads of 18th century stuff, because I just loved that. And so we researched and we did that film, and I had a really great time working with her. She, because she got Gladiator, I had a ball researching that. And spent all my days in my office with all the research, and because that was such a massive movie, and sort of trained on the job, and so fortunate.
Well, what I find interesting about all of that is you did mostly. I mean, yeah, Black Hawk Down was more modern, but you were doing The Merchant of Venice, and then you got Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if any,
Well,
if
that's
any,
a story.
yeah, I was going to say, if anyone knows anything about that, talk about the costumes. I mean, they're all over the place. You've got Zaphod Beeblebrox, the two-headed president of the galaxy. You've got
Yeah.
Vogons. You've got Slarty Bartfast. You've got all these characters. How did you go from doing period work to jumping onto something like Hitchhiker's Guide?
Well, I genuinely think that goes back to what I witnessed and what I worked on in theatre, because theatre doesn't have to be historically correct. And the way that the Royal Exchange approached things, and all the designers that I worked under, were so inspirational in those 4 years, and all had this approach of like, they do their version of a period. So it could be like a modern overtone of 1750 or 1520 or whatever, and worked on some seriously amazing productions that made me realize that here's your research, but then there's your version of it.
Right.
And that's why the jump from doing fantasy to period is so easy for me, because I don't think that you have to necessarily just be truthful to the
Sure.
research. You can make your version of that. So that's why that lends itself very well to a kind of a fantasy, like with Stardust, those kind of films that you can bring your period bit in to explain this character, but add a bit of spice, or whatever.
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting because so when you did Hitchhikers, you had, first of all, there was the radio play, then you had the novel, then you
Yeah.
had the BBC series, and then you said you had the screenplay. So when you have something that has various iterations before you get there, do you still look at the script first, or did you go back and look at the BBC series? Did you listen to the radio play? How did you begin something like
Well,
Hitchhikers?
read the book, obviously. That in that instance, I read the book. But the reason I did that film was before I was in film and TV and all that. I did pop promos with a group of guys called Hammer and Tongs. And that was very early in my career. And we did lots of crazy pop promos where we had headless people. We had the band in a house where the whole walls blew out and all their clothes blew off. And I had to do all that kind of techie thing where you pull all the clothes off, and did crazy kind of. There was one I think we did where the band was in the middle as like an art thing, and we threw paint at them. And that was all part of them morphing into something else. And so I worked with this group of guys who were into puppetry, models, prosthetics, anything goes with them. And so I did a lot of work with them, and then they got Hitchhikers and asked me to work on it. So and they're the perfect people to do it, because they were such a young, very vibrant group of guys who looked at things in a different perspective. And then because I'd worked with them so much, it just fitted in. And so we read the book, then we read the screenplay, and then took our version of it. And we you look back at the things that were done on the TV series, which a lot of people still hold dear, including my husband. And then we just kind of took our version of it, I suppose. It was such a long time ago.
Well, you did terrific work. I mean, it was funny. I was always wondering, like, how would they do? It's not really a costume, but how are they going to do Marvin the Paranoid Android? And the design was so perfect. And having Alan Rickman do the voice, I'm like, only fans could have come up with that. So it was great.
Yeah, that film was very much a case of, like, there was a lot of people involved in all the different versions of the characters. So, and I think people at Henson were involved in that.
Yeah.
That was just before they closed. So there was a lot of the creature stuff done with them, and then we kind of, we had a merging of certain things, and then I did my own bit over here, and there was a lot in the few characters that were on the ship, for instance, that a lot came with those few characters. So
right.
And two-headed man, I'm thinking back. It was, and I would come up with things like, how do we do all the builders of the world? Like, we get them these big orange wellies that you wear if you're going into radiation, and just kind of have some. It was fun. We had to make it fun, and not it wasn't too serious, I think.
Well, I guess it couldn't be. It's Hitchhiker's Guide, but then I think it's really interesting looking at the turn that your career took. From Hitchhiker's Guide, which came out in 2005, first of all, then you went to Kinky Boots, which was great, but then you did a series of comic book themed movies. You did V for Vendetta, which is of course based on Alan Moore's story, and then Stardust, which is what Neil Gaiman, and then Hellboy II: The Golden Army, which was a Dark Horse comic, and then Kick-Ass, which you reunited with Matthew Vaughn. A number of so you now work with him twice on Stardust and Kick-Ass, but so now you're ensconced in comic book land, and you've kept a great career working. Obviously, you've made it to the Tiffany standard of comic book movies, which is Marvel. But starting there, I'm blown away by the diversity of the costumes and the things that you were called upon to create. V for Vendetta obviously might have been just a future period piece. So it was, it's a little dystopian, a little drab. But then you jump to Stardust, which is with the star power in Stardust, and suddenly I just wondered if you could sort of address, like, when you were growing up, were you a fan of science fiction, fantasy, and horror films, and did you read comics?
I was a big fan of Star Wars. From 10 when I saw the first one, and
that's when I saw it too.
And I was just like, I want to do that. I don't know what that is. I don't know how it is, but I want to be involved in that. And I think that was always in the back of my mind. Actually, that was a real, like, pivotal moment in seeing that film at 10 years old and going, I was so ensconced in the story and so believed that this was a real thing, it really kind of hit me. And I think I've always felt like the films that I want to work on, I want the audience to have that same emotion that I had when I was 10 and I watched A New Hope, and that it makes me kind of go, because I think that's good storytelling, and that's what film's about, you know. So the costume part of it is the big journey into giving characters their you know, their reality that people can really hold on to. I think with Stardust, I had such a good time designing that.
I can
It was
only, I mean, the design of that movie is beautiful. It's
so it
just
was
beautiful.
really hard work, really. Like I think I was a very young designer when I did that, and it was, you know, I didn't realize how big it was until I was kind of on it and going, oh my God. Um,
And the
and I,
actors that you're designing for, you were designing for some legends.
yeah, I know. I can't, do you know, I don't even think about that as much as I'm just so fixated on like making sure that, you know, the clothes are okay. But I think with that film particularly, Matthew has a very interesting way of working because he doesn't have any boundaries when it comes to like it has to be period correct or it has to be this or that. But he has this way of sometimes going, I'm going to pluck this from over here, and it doesn't fit in with this period or this style, but I'm going to put it in here, and it works. And that's how we did Stardust. And I kind of put it all into different blocks, and you know, you had the Charlie Cox's character, and then you know, all that came with that, and then you've got these a whole other world where we put it into sections. So I was looking at like really ancient sculptures,
Mm.
and then 18th century period, and then westerns, and you know, bringing it all in. And it's a bit of a running joke now that I always like to have ponchos and gaiters in all my films because I'm just a massive fan of westerns. And
Well, even V and V for Vendetta had a pretty good, call it a
yeah,
poncho, call it, I don't know what you would call that, cape,
yeah,
you know.
Kate, yeah, I know yeah, there's always an element of that I try to shoehorn in somewhere just because I think it's cool. And I think with Stardust, that was definitely a culmination of all different kinds of research coming together, and independently, all the characters, they didn't necessarily have a place in any one period.
Right.
But I just, you know, with the witches, for instance, we looked at the snake ladies, that for them, you know, the Minoan snake ladies, and then I found all these different fabrics, and we kind of constructed the costumes as we got to know the characters more, and then made the older ones first, and then made them younger afterwards. So you had these two versions of the same look, and they were based in lots of different periods all
Right.
together. And I think that's what I enjoy doing is more than the straight kind of period stuff.
Sure.
I'm not I love doing that as well, but I kind of get a bit excited and kind of go, oh, why don't we just put this collar with this top, and or this, you know, texture that is completely not right and put it with this. And it also, one of the things I've realized about my work as I've looked back is I'm definitely, my stuff I don't think is kind of bright and colorful. I think I really am into grungy textures in a way, and making things feel like they sit in instead of like ping, you know. And the more I go on, the more I'm into kind of getting the breakdown department to go, no, go further, don't be scared, push it, pull that color in and out. You know, we need, and no costume is complete to me unless it's been painted into and dyed over and ripped to shreds or whatever. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting when it comes to, I think, fantasy filmmaking and also specifically superhero costumes. You think back to like 1978 when Christopher Reeve played
Yeah.
Superman. I mean, that was a spandex costume.
Yeah.
It was very brightly colored, right out of the pages of a Superman comic. And then 11 years later, we get Tim Burton's Batman, where suddenly we change it all up. Batman is not wearing
Yeah.
spandex. He's got an exterior. He's got basically armored up costume. And then in the 90s, we saw like The Crow, Brandon Lee's
Yeah.
The Crow, which, you know, again, distressed leather like you were talking about. And then I think the entry of the modern comic book costume was in Blade, the first
Yes.
Blade. You know, Wesley Snipes played, that costume was incredible, and that
Yeah.
costume led into Bryan Singer's X-Men in 2000, which gave way to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. And again, Spider-Man could have been a printed a printed spandex costume, but it wasn't. It was multi-layered. It had texture. It had sort of the spider over the fabric.
Yeah.
And then we saw this sort of the evolution of the comic book costume. And like you were saying, you started using different fabrics, wanting to distress them and giving dimensionality to the costumes, which gave those costumes, I always like to say, verisimilitude, a reality that leapt beyond, say, the 4-color pages of a comic. You had to do that to bring those characters into the real world. And yet people still want color. I mean, when you see a comic book character, but if somebody's wearing spandex today, running around, no one's going to believe it. No one's going to buy.
I know. It's the bar's set high now, isn't it?
It is. I mean, but it was interesting because then you went from V for Vendetta and Stardust to Hellboy, which, I mean, Hellboy, those costumes and the design, again, another Hellboy II, The Golden Army, beautiful design work.
That, working with Guillermo del Toro is just like amazing. He is such an artist and he brings so much to the table with all these textures and colors. He always has a color theory, and I just loved working with him. And he's such an artist, and I draw, so I kind of he does drawings, and it was like a language you can have without speaking. And so the creation of all those characters, I really went to town with the dyeing, the ombre from one color to another, and textures and armor, and using little bone things for the armor on the prince. And I don't know, we came up with all kinds of strange and wonderful things, with like horns with things wrapped around them for those priests. I can't even remember all of it now, actually.
That was amazing stuff. Now, when you go back, I mean, Hellboy, obviously, it was really the product of one man, Mike Mignola's imagination. So when you go back and you're on something like Hellboy, it's not like there's 40 years of various artists who have worked on the project. It's really only the product of one man. Do you go back and look at the issues of Hellboy?
We did, yeah, definitely. Just to, the look of Hellboy himself, he's always that was a growing thing, and I think you always want to take that character on a journey from the first to the second one, and then on, I presume. And I know we did a lot of research into the big coat, and his look is quite set, so you can't really change it that much, but you have to look at what is going on in the comic book and texturally be quite faithful to that if you can. The overtones of that is all very kind of, there's a lot of red involved in
hell.
And actually that was something that Guillermo was always very keen on. He did a color journey, which is such an interesting way of looking at how you want the film the audience to be pulled through the film, is through color.
Right.
And I loved that, because it really helps you with your fabrics, that you know if he's going to use a red light, what to do with that fabric and that color, and what color it's going to go, what colors you mustn't put into that scene because they'll turn a completely different color. So that's an interesting journey, and I feel like it's very comic booky. I think it was, it's got that kind of.
It's stunning. Golden Army is a stunningly beautiful film. I mean, everything about it. Now, I would ask you, do you have like an army of people around the world that you source your fabrics from? Like, do you have people in different, like I know somebody in Florence, or I know somebody, in Rome?
Yeah, I mean, do you know, we do sometimes. The world has changed, and fabrics are actually becoming very tricky. And
why is that?
I think it's expensive, and obviously right now it's even more tricky because of the pandemic. But I think when I was first starting out, when I started in theatre, I could come to London and walk down Berwick Street, and there'd be loads of different shops, and you'd always go into Borovics, for instance, and it was like a cave of stuff, and you'd see fabrics you've never seen anywhere else. Now you just don't see those fabrics anymore, because they're not just on the roll to buy. You have to go and order them from Italy or France, and so it's a bit more difficult to source things. So I have buyers that I work with, and we always kind of call up people that we might know in various places, or send someone, or I'll go to Italy or or France, or mainly that's where we get the stuff from, really. And then the Far East, and or you get the shops to help you out, because it's there's definitely a lot less fabric around than there used to be. And one of the things in more recent times I've been doing is we actually make the fabrics. So you might have a base fabric, and then you'll print or dye on top of it, and then you'll do more effects, so you can get something that's completely unique. As long as you need, if you need stretch or drape or whatever, and then you can, work more by building the pattern yourself, or the texture. I think that's more approach that we've made in recent years, really. Yeah.
Well, then jumping up to something like Kick-Ass, even though I was talking about the evolution of comic costumes, Kick-Ass has all of the different, because Kick-Ass is more of that spandex, stretchy fabric, and then you've got Hit Girl, who has, like, she's kind of put together different things like a girl would, and then her dad, Big Daddy, is basically in that Tim Burton-esque Batman costume. So you've done the whole history of comic book costumes in one movie.
Yeah.
Was that something you were consciously aware of?
It was very conscious. So when we did Kick-Ass, there was only, I think, 4 or 5 issues of the comic.
Right.
So they'd only touched on Kick-Ass himself and Hit Girl in one, I think, and then Red Mist was in there, but it was a very simple shape. And what Matthew wanted was us to kind of push it way further, be faithful to Kick-Ass, but then take all the other characters and put yourself in the mind of, if you were a teenage boy and you wanted to dress up as this particular superhero, where would you go? What would you buy? How would you pimp it? And that was the approach. So basically, there were things that could have been bought, but they've been slightly altered, so that it's more accessible and believable. None of them had superpowers. They weren't superheroes. So the idea is they're dressing up as superheroes because they, the journey takes them in the various ways within that film. And obviously Big Daddy had a very ulterior motive. He was dressed, in combat gear, basically.
Right.
And he bought stuff in and clad himself in a kind of cool sort of way. And we kind of looked at stuff that was on the internet at the time, like the Future Soldier and all that kind of stuff, and then tried to kind of go, well, he'll have looked at that online and gone, I'm going to try and build that and build his version of it. So that was the inspiration for all those characters, really, was that they'd done it themselves.
Right. And I think you did a great job, with that, and on Kick-Ass too. And then I have to say, I really loved Imitation Game, quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
But between the two, you got to have your first taste of jumping into Marvel, even though it was over when Fox was still Fox. You went over and you did X-Men First Class with Matthew Vaughn, and unlike the other X-Men movies, which sort of took place in the other than opening in Auschwitz, like the first X-Men did, you got to go back. Not only were you jumping into the Marvel universe with the X-Men, but you got to go back and do it as the 60s. The movie was set in the early 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, and you made choices, like you were able to go back, and the X-Men at the time had all been clad in their leather sort of mission wear, but then you went back and you gave them color in their costumes, the yellow and the black, and which was going back to the classic X-Men look. What was it like taking on? I mean, you got to go from, again, a concentration camp with young Magneto, young Eric Lenscher, and then go into the swinging 60s, and you must have had a ball on that film, because my God, first of all, it's a great movie, but all the character designs and everything that you got to do, the Hellfire Club, was that the pinnacle of your comic book? I mean, Stardust was pretty amazing. I'll say that. But I loved Stardust because, like you said, but for me, X-Men, I've been an X-Men fan since I was a little kid. And there was so much to draw upon, not just the previous movies, but then you could go back and you actually had the 1960s. And being that you're from England, I don't think there's any cooler place in the 60s than London would have been. So what was it like coming into the world? Like you said, you have Magneto's helmet behind you,
Yeah.
but you already had kind of a direction that they had established in the films. But and I guess what I want to ask, because I want to ask this about Ant-Man too. You had again previously existing films. You had all of the comics, and yet you had Matthew Vaughn, who has his obviously big ideas, and Jane wrote that script as well. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what was it like to jump into your first experience with Marvel, and where do you begin with something like X-Men First Class?
Well, I can say it was terrifying. There was such a lot of weight on the suits. And interestingly, I
How
think the
how
other,
how come?
because we were going back in time,
Hmm.
and they were, there was a lot of worry over how we could make it look cool in the 60s. Um, and what we did was we sort of looked at the other films, all had like these kind of dark suits, and they were all very, very similar. And in a way, they wanted to sort of keep that theme, but have them all slightly different, which is kind of what they did in the other films. But I was handed the very first copy of X-Men from 1963, I think it was. And on the front cover, you've got all the characters on there in these little pants, meaning underpants,
Yeah.
and they were yellow and blue. And we, basically, Matthew said, "I want this to be the inspiration," and I was like, "Okay." And
Wow.
so we came up with this. We researched into everything that NASA had done that you can access, in terms of spacesuits and pressure suits and textures and how they fit this bit to this bit and this bit, you know. And then we came up with these suits that are not spandex at all, not stretchy at all, and then
Right.
built stretch in by doing what the NASA research showed us, where there's little, lines of fabric that have a stretching behind, so they bend in certain places. I'm not saying that they were the most movable suits, but I think that they could do all the action in them. But also what we did is we found this fabric that had like blue and black fibers in it, and then I had them basically twin needle little tiny oblongs over the whole surface of each panel, so it gave it this kind of texture that
Yeah.
lifted. And then the yellow part, we did a lot of research into Kevlar and when it was first invented, and then found something. We tried Kevlar itself, but it kept breaking the needles. The scissors. So you couldn't actually cut it. You need a special pair of scissors. And also, what we found was we put it outside to see what it would do, because we were been told that it sometimes does stuff in the light, and it just started changing color. So we couldn't actually use Kevlar. So we found a weave that was similar, dyed it to the same color, and layered it up so it had this Kevlar feel. So obviously that was developed by DuPont in 1963. And it was, I think the thought was that the yellow on the comic book cover was to reflect that development in tech.
I love that you were going back and actually looking at fabric and things from the time.
Yeah.
And again, just adding that extra layer of, I mean, this is what people out there listening, this is what great costume designers do. This is why you make the big bucks, because what a brilliant conceit to actually go back and grab your materials that would be period. I guess do you think that came out of working on period costumes early in your career, that you're like, why not go back and look at what they were doing at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I went back to when I was at art college and I was 16 and 17, and they'd take us on these journeys to places like the Bath Costume Museum, and they'd actually get the clothes out that were just almost falling in bits. And so that, I suppose that must be an inspiration to, that stuff really does still exist. And if you go to Italy, you can go in museums and see the original kind of 15th, 16th, 17th century fabrics. I think that going back to the source fabric to understand its texture and its depth and its color, and how the difference in the dyes and the just the feel of everything. I think it's good to research that, and you go as far as you can to see if you can find it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, you had. I can only imagine how much fun that movie was to design, because you didn't just have superheroes; you had civilian work, and you're going into
Yeah.
clubs and diplomats and suits
Yeah.
and all kinds of things. I mean, it was a beautifully done film, and the
Oh,
actors. I
thank
mean,
you.
putting clothes on people like Kevin Bacon and Michael Fassbender. I mean, they just looked great.
Oh,
That it really, again, another movie that has an overall. I mean, it makes sense coming from like doing Stardust and doing and having. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship you have when you work with directors like Ridley Scott, or especially like Matthew Vaughn, when you work with them over and over again? What kind of rapport do you develop with your directors
it,
and the directors of photography, because light plays a big deal?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I have worked with a few times, but often if I might not be available for the next time, and you kind of go, oh, damn, because I really love the diversity of working with different people. But with Matthew, I worked with him quite a few times, and I think you kind of learn how they like things, and
Mm.
learn, you know, what bits that you can have as a shorthand of their style likes and dislikes, and things like whether they the colors that they don't like is an interesting one. I think with Ridley, I only worked with him as an assistant and then did Black Hawk Down as a designer, but I kind of knew he's very much kind of likes everything to be real, and and he's such an artist. He draws. That's an incredible thing to be able to have. That language to me is like, I really love that. It's the same with Guillermo, with the drawing. And with Matthew, he's very into the style of things, and in a very different way. And I suppose if I look at all three films I did, and then Kick-Ass 2 he was a producer on,
Mm-hmm.
um, definitely there's a style that he likes, which is, it's that he's very into suits, and he's very into, snappy style, and it's got to look expensive, and if it's a diamond, it's got to be a big diamond, and that kind of thing. I remember on Stardust, there was the whole thing about the necklace, and we came up with this necklace, which is actually Matthew's coat of arms involved in the
Wow.
necklace. There's the two animals intertwined over it, and we spent ages trying to find the right substance to make that out of, because obviously a sapphire that big on a ruby that big is impossible to buy. And so there's, he's very into his details, and they're very key to his storytelling.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, then, I could spend hours talking to you about all these movies. I want to get through everything I want to talk to you about. Then your first movie with Alex Garland was Ex Machina. Now, the
Yeah.
thing about Ex Machina, it's basically like a play. You've got three people
Yeah.
in an enclosed space, and obviously
Yeah.
some of the great physical effects that Alicia, she's playing a robot, but the effects involved in bringing her to life were amazing. But how do you, when you're approaching a movie where it's basically three characters in a house, how do you approach that from a costume design standpoint to keep it visually interesting?
Well, I mean, it's characterization. It's the four people in that house were all
Oh, that's right.
very,
There's
very
four. There's because they're.
difficult.
I
There's
didn't
the
want to
silent
spoil
one.
the
Yeah,
fourth person.
yeah. There's I suppose the Alicia's character isn't a person really.
And no,
Um,
neither is the other person. But we won't.
no, but you don't know.
Yeah, we don't know that. Uh-oh, we
Spoiler.
just spoiled everything. No.
You've got four very, very individual scenarios that all have their own history of where they've been, where they've come from, and why they're at this point in this house together. So, really a lovely journey
Mm-hmm.
from a costume perspective. You've got your rich guy, you've got the guy that works for him who's going, why did I win this? Oh God, I'm coming into this big house. Then you've got the two other characters that are both there for different, same reason, but very different characters. Um, and yeah, it was really great to do something like that, because it was so contained and yet so powerful. Great script, and genius director, and he's amazing to work with. And I I think they originally approached me to do that film because of the suit, because of the robot, because they'd done some research into it and been told that it would cost hundreds of thousands and to do it in prosthetic. And then they said, look, you've done these kind of things before, can you how do you approach it? And I was like, okay, let me take it away and have a think about this.
Wow.
Because they wanted, basically, Alex wanted the whole suit to feel like it was her skin. So it couldn't have been like clothing or a piece of armor or anything. So we actually ended up creating the fabric. We bought this stretchy stuff that was a hexagonal, and then we embedded, we dipped it into a type of urethane that had metal powder dipped into it, and then we laid it onto Teflon, let it dry so it was only curved on the top
Wow.
and flat on the bottom, and then we made the suit out of that. And the next thing after that was, I don't want to see any seams in it. So we had to make it as seamless as possible. So stretching something over a body without any seams is really tricky without getting wrinkles. But we managed it, and we worked very heavily with Andrew Whitehead. Is it Andrew White? I can't remember his second name. Sorry, Andrew. Um, from DNEG, in where we could put the bands on the arms and where it would fill in, and then the mesh was still in those areas, and so he could lay it over his things afterwards. So it was a very to and fro with
Yeah,
their.
was this the closest you ever worked with an effects team, like doing, because the way that the visual effects, I believe it won an Academy Award, didn't it, for visual effects?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I thought that I think it's some of a great combination of costume design and physical effects ever done for a movie,
Oh, thank
because
you.
I mean, I can only imagine how difficult that was. Was there a lot of tests involved, like what you were doing in terms of
Yeah,
with
a
the
little bit.
effects team?
Yeah, we had to. It was more to do with body marks than anything, and where we put the black lines that we made as a real thing, rather than it being a black line that they had to take out. We made it so it had screws in it and things, so they could use that as their marker for where they put the
Wow.
mechanics, and then they laid the top layer back over. And it was amazing. And originally, I think the line was going to be above the breasts in that one, but then we moved it below because it was weird for them to be doing that bit, I think, and they didn't work. So we moved around with the lines a bit until we got the shapes right, so it was flattering on her body. Um, and it was very, very tight on her, in order to achieve there was a shot that Alex wanted where she turns off the camera, and he wanted to shoot across her body, and he wanted to see the undulation of the mesh going across the body like this without doing it in a VFX. So we strove to get as much in camera as possible so they could concentrate on the bits
Yeah.
that they put in. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
because
it was a very, very close working relationship. But I think I'd done a lot of VFX before that,
yeah.
um, as well, but not that intensely at that point, I think.
Well, I mean, a character that's half VFX too, a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Is seeing through her, or
yeah.
it was a marvelous collaboration. I mean, what a great, in terms of cinematic robots or androids, one of the greats of all time is Ex
Oh God,
Machina.
thank you.
I
Yeah.
mean, well,
Oh,
that was probably a good preparatory. So now your next movie, you jump into the MCU. You
yeah.
jump into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When you got there, I mean, Ant-Man came out in 2015. When you got there, they had firmly established themselves. I mean, they were already huge.
Yeah.
Avengers came out in 2012, and one of the great strengths that I've always felt, especially as somebody who's read Marvel comics since I was a kid, is their costume design. And I mean, everyone talks about it, but I think people just kind of take it for granted now. But I think that the costumes, the superhero costumes in the MCU, both have that verisimilitude, that reality, yet they're still redolent of the comic books, but they're not slavish
Yeah.
recreations. There's something unique to the films. And one of my favorites is Ant-Man.
Oh,
That first, and now I know because even one of the co-hosts of this show is a visual development artist for Marvel. So I know that, when you walk into something like that, they've had developers come up with the looks of these things, but it's one thing to look at a painting and look at beautiful design work, and it's a whole nother thing to make a costume that's going to work in the real world. And
yeah.
the Ant-Man costume, I think, is deceptively, it might be simple, it might look, but it's deceptively intricate, isn't it? I mean, there's multiple layers on
First
that
one.
costume.
Yeah, the
How?
first one.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
first, yes, the first one, which I think is my favorite because there's a retro feel to it because it is retro in the actual film itself. It was made before, so you have to have a period. How? First of all, what was it like coming into the MCU? Like when you get the call, like does light shine down from heaven? Like what happens?
Yeah, it was like, really? Yeah, no, it was a really enjoyable experience. And I did that film entirely in America, took my whole family over there. Um, and yeah, the suit itself, we did a little test a while before we actually did the film to
Mm,
proof of concept it. And I think we were given a drawing and asked, can you create this so we can do this little short test footage? And we did it in 4 weeks. And we kind of like, okay, let's get some leather. And it's meant to be kind of period 60s-esque. And we worked out really quickly, marked it out in a very simple format. Um, and then when we came to do the real thing, it was about 2 years later, in fact, I think, we obviously started really looking into the textures of it because the design was pretty set at that point because we'd done the test before then.
sure.
And one of the impossibilities of that suit was that they wanted pipes that were running through it that had these little connectors and stood above the surface.
Yep.
So immediately when you're dealing with fabric, that's tricky. It's the same with going in or out, really tricky. Out is easier, in is really, really tricky. So we came. I have one of my really good colleagues who I've worked with for over 35 years is Ivo, and he's done most of my films with armor and all kinds of hard costume prop parts. So we worked together to create. He came up with this idea that he could mold the pipes and have a piece of fabric embedded so we could stitch it in on the underneath. And it was
Wow.
really complicated, but at that time we didn't know how else to do it. So it was a real journey. And then also there was the red parts of it that we decided we would experiment with. That we looked at and insect eyes and look at the different textures in the cones of insects. And came up with this print that we got printed.
Wow.
And we had a lot of different experiments on that, many. We even tried to do laser cutting and it just burnt the leather, so we couldn't use that. And then, it just came together in the end, but it was just a really long journey to get that suit together.
Well, I have to say, I mean, of all, like I told you, I collect the Hot Toys action figures of all the MCU characters, and why they're so great to have, and even though they're hideously expensive, is those costumes are so great. And that first Ant-Man costume, like you said, I mean, all of that piping, it all worked. I mean, you knew you immediately gave Scott Lang an identity that set him apart from the other characters that had already been established. I mean, it was a really great design, and it looked incredible on camera.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that we did in that, I think it was always a kind of conversation as to how much we can get away with in CG and how much we build. And one of the things Ivo and I were really kind of like, we really want to build it. We really want to build it
Yep.
complete. We built it complete with the lights as well. So all the red lights were real, and they used that on camera so they could get the peripheral light off all the things. And that was, I think, when we started the film, I remember having a meeting with various people at Marvel, and they were going, well, we've learned from Iron Man, We don't have to do it all
Right.
necessarily. You know, and I kind of get that because that's like a really massive suit. And I was like, no, I'm convinced we can build it. So we did. And in the end, it came out okay.
Well, I think that's what makes, Marvel, they have such an understanding of how the production process of these films, they've got it down to a science. So
Yeah.
there is a great synergy between full CGI, like you can go from, say, Tom Holland in a Spider-Man suit to the CGI where he's spinning around New York City and then landing in a practical suit, and it's
Yeah.
seamless. I mean, they've done a
Yeah.
great
It's
job of
amazing.
that. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Totally.
Well, now, this has been I should probably talk about the marquee, what we're talking about this week. This was probably, for me personally, one of my most eagerly awaited MCU films, Eternals, because one, I'm a big Jack Kirby fan, and I thought it was an interesting choice because it's not exactly. I mean, I remember in 2008 when Iron Man came out, people were like, well, Iron Man's a second tier character. People don't know Iron. And I'm like, really? Is that
Yeah.
true? And then, of course, Iron Man becomes, I think one of the classic movie moments is Robert Downey Jr. snapping his fingers, I am Iron Man. And, it kills him, but it also brings back the world or whatever. But so the Eternals to me was a really fascinating choice to
Yeah.
make. And then you have the choice of Chloe Zhao. I mean, one of the geniuses of Kevin Feige is he's tapping directors from
Yeah.
places that you wouldn't normally. And she hadn't even finished Nomadland yet when Kevin Feige found her and brought her on board, which I think was another genius move. I mean, James Gunn had only made $3 million. He'd made Super and he'd made Slither, but Kevin Feige's like, no, come make my $150 million crazy Guardians of the Galaxy. You're the perfect guy. Nobody else in Hollywood history would do what he does, what Kevin does. Like, I know him, I've never met him, but what Kevin Feige does, tapping these creative people. So I just curious, how did you find yourself? Obviously, you're working on Quantum Mania now, but how did you get involved in Eternals? And was it just, were you not busy then because you'd done things like Artemis Fowl and Jurassic World, so you've been working on these big projects? How did you get the call back to come do Eternals? Because Eternals is, the costumes are indelible that you've made, and I have to say, I hope Hot Toys makes all of them because I will buy all of
Yeah.
those. I love those. I loved the Eternals costume so much I can't even tell you. But how did you get involved?
So I think I had just finished Artemis Fowl. And I was meant to be doing Nile, but I can't. Yeah, I think I finished Artemis Fowl, and I got a call from one of the producers saying, "We got this film. We'd love you to meet for it." And so I had a Zoom meeting actually, which is weird because it was way before the pandemic. Now everyone does it. And then yeah, they asked me to do it, and I read the treatment first. And when I had the interview, I was like, "Oh my God, this is like, you realize how much costume this is." It goes through every period in
Well,
time,
that's what
all of it,
yeah.
you know, and all of it was unresearched. Like very little research is in existence for Mesopotamia.
Yeah, let's
The
go back to Babylon. Yeah,
Yeah, I
what are you
know.
gonna do?
Like you've got a few carvings and a few, paintings from the Gupta period, and yeah, or each period you went through, not a lot of research is there that you can really hold on to.
But then you've got your, like you said earlier, your theater experience. It doesn't have to be exactly period
Yeah,
accurate. It can be redolent of the period. People just have to believe it.
yeah, exactly. So we did our research, very extensive research on that film. We even spoke to anthropologists about each period so that we could understand, what we were looking at. Particularly if you look at, say, for instance, the Babylonian carvings into stone and stuff. it, how to interpret what is actually carved is really tricky, because you go, oh well, it's zigzagging stuff down the body and they've got this curly hair, but actually, is it that? And so having I did something years and years ago, which was a drama docu about ancient Egypt. So we had a very similar kind of approach, having gone through the research for that. I thought, I know how we've got to research this really carefully, because you could make very drastic assumptions that might be quite incorrect to represent those periods. So we were very careful in not wanting to put something that is like, for instance, in the Aztec period, you don't want to misrepresent the Aztecs' history.
Right.
So we did really intensive research into all the code, the code, what they call the codexes, those things that the monks came back with from their travels when they went over there with the Spanish, and it's all symbols and stuff. So we had to get people in to just kind of check things, particularly with the Aztec stuff, because you've got these eagle and, you know, leopard warriors that, you know, are represented that look like a chicken with a man in feathers, and you go, are we serious? Oh, is this what we're doing? And really question it. You know, and that's just the historical part of it. That doesn't bring in, you know, our other characters that had to go through all those periods as well, but they were all dressed in their version of those periods within the course. So it was huge in terms of costume. 10 superheroes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it drew upon, you know, your experience doing period stuff earlier in your career, so you were doing that, and at the same time you had to correct. One of the things that the Eternals costumes themselves, I think are absolutely beautiful. But like you said earlier, it seems to me that at first are they hard armor? Or are they what it looks like they're very layered, and they're full body. Like in other costumes, the costumes have, like, sometimes Black Widow might be in a full on spandex or a leather one piece zip up suit, but those are pretty confining costumes. And they had to move because people have to be able to move like they can walk in everyday life and fight in them. So how difficult was it because I was looking at close-up photographs of the costumes, and it looks like there were many, many pieces and many layers to those costumes. How did you go about, first of all, were they already designed when you got there and you had to figure out, well, how do we do this in real life? Or did you get in on the design process?
Yeah, so I was in quite early, and they'd come up with various concepts, and Chloe had her kind of version of what she wanted them to go towards, which was she was very much not wanting armor. She was very much not wanting spandex, and she wanted something that was we've all described now as a ceremonial skin or a ceremonial suit.
Wow. Okay.
So the idea was that it's representative of the entity that they are. It's really hard to put it into words, really, because a lot of this is very kind of like, you know, otherworldly in a way.
Yeah.
They're beings, they're not humans. So what we wanted to do was
they're Eternals.
We had the where did we start? I mean, we were given drawings that this is the world in which we want to go, and eventually I said, look, you know, we were concepting, and it was like, you're never going to get any further with this unless we take the bodies that we're going to use and start actually building on them. So we almost took the essence of the designs and then started working with the bodies. And then beyond that, we there was obviously colors that were representative of each character. So what we did was we decided, okay, here's our 10, these are our color theory. What is the surface of these costumes? Because what was drawn was a skin that looked like prosthetic with gold lines going into the body. And I kept saying, this is really tricky. You know, if you want it to be more softer and clothing, we can't do this in fabric. So we need to find some way in which to make the language of what is needed by the soft floaty parts when they're in the wind, but still it's really like a shell.
That design work was all part of the technology. You see it throughout the sets, you see it throughout their spacecraft, you see it even all the way back to the Celestials. So all of the piping and stuff that was really, in a way, their technology.
Yeah, so we obviously, there's a language that was developed for everything. So there's a celestial language, and then the circles. Chloe was very, very into the Jack Kirby circles. And that was something that we all were like, we always have to have a curve. There's no square lines. There's no
Right.
square corners. There's no, it's all curves. So that was very important that all those lines were in, and then those lines were then put into the wall behind them in the ship, and then that's how it's kind of they're
Because
linked.
like those costumes are almost like generated. They're an extension of the technology of the
Yes,
Celestials that were given to the Eternals.
they are. Yeah, they are almost meant to be like a skin.
Yeah.
But obviously doing that prosthetics would have been way too costly, way too long every day, and actually the amount you go through for the time that they were in it would be impossible to film. So we came up with this method. So we looked at the universe and we took photographs and we researched into photographs of the Milky Way and nebulas and kind of looked at all that, and then we decided the only way we're ever going to make these look completely unique, because you can't buy that pattern, you can't print that pattern.
Right.
So what we did was, and this is really random, we got big boards and we made from all our research, I got the whole breakdown team to start making oil paintings out of oil and paint and metal powder. So you've got these like nebula style paintings, and we made about 50 of them. And then we chose certain ones to be certain characters, and even down to the colors. And then we used that as our reference, and we scanned that, and then we parted the patterns digitally, and then we dyed up stretch fabric to start with, and then printed layer after layer on top of these fabrics in different ways. So you had like a base print, and then you had a urethane, like it was like a sort of a plastic finish. Oh God, what was it called now? I can't remember. Just different types of substance that you can print onto fabrics to give this layered effect. And then they were over dyed again, and then they were made. That was part of the costume, and then those patterns were then transferred on it by hand painting onto the harder pieces. So all the harder pieces that you see on the bodies, like with the, say for instance, Icarus, his chest or whatever, that's all a type of soft urethane that was all done, and that was done by scanning the actor's body, and then we used that, scanned that into the computer, and then built on top of that with all those shapes, and then printed them on a 3D printer, sanded them down, made sure they were all perfect, made a mold of them, and then made them in these urethanes that were all colored to base colors of their costumes, and then hand painted over, and then all the gold. And so you actually look closely at them, the areas around certain arms and legs or what have you, you've got like a pipe in, but the harder parts go in. So all the bodies and all the shoulders and the arms have the gold ridges going into the body. So it was very, very technical, and hundreds of pieces in each one.
Yeah, well, one of the things I also love about those costumes is the colors you chose. Like the blue isn't too bright. Like Icarus is blue. It's like a perfect blue. Kingo's purple. Did you have to do experiments in terms of the actual shades of those colors? And especially when you put them all, in every trailer, they show the shot when they're all standing next to each other and all the colors. So not only did the individual colors have to be right, but then when you put all the characters together, one couldn't be too garish, too loud. It had to was that tough to do?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to get the balance of the color, there's not one of those costumes is one color. They all have multicolors within them. So for instance, Icarus's has got black, navy blue, a lighter blue, and then a touch of electric blue. And actually when we finished the costumes, another part of that was we had someone go over with foil in tiny little spots everywhere. So you look in the sky and it goes like that. So you look at the fabric, it does the same thing. But the colors there are lots of colors within each costume. Even Druig, it was black, it's like metal black and silver, and then a dense black, and then red. His is the only one that's only red in the lines.
Right.
Yeah. And sorry. I think Thana's is was very pale gold,
Mm-hmm.
rather than it being a deep gold, what you'd expect. We wanted to keep that quite subtle.
Was there another, like, obviously a lot of the Marvel films are shot in Atlanta and there's a lot of green screen, and one of the things that was celebrated, or has been, they've made a lot about, is that Chloe Zhao wanted to shoot this more on real locations.
Yeah.
So you
Yes.
then have to deal with a lot more daylight issues, and you talked about how things look in the light. Did you have to do experiments like underneath sunlight and things that you wouldn't necessarily normally have to do as much because the lighting couldn't be as controlled in terms of how these
Yeah.
things would reflect off this? Like if you're
Yeah.
on the beach shooting by water, you've got the reflection coming off the water, you've got sunlight. Was that
Yeah.
problematic at all?
Yeah, I mean, we had to be very careful with shine, because the surfaces needed to be shiny so they didn't look like fabric, and yet not too shiny that it's mirrored. And another thing we had to bear in mind was a lot of urethanes that we use. I've used this technique on quite a few films actually. If you put it in sunlight, after about a day, it will change color or change its.
Oh
So we had to work
no.
out which substance was the best for the raininess of England versus the Fuerteventura in the hot wind and rain. Sorry, hot
Wow.
wind. Yeah. So there was a lot. There was a lot of experimentation, and also we didn't really have enough time to make them actually, even though we had a lot of prep, but it was just like the amount of R&D we had to do to get the patterns right, and then just before you've even got to start building them, and then when you're fitting the actors, the amount of movement that they had to do, we had to make sure that every single movement they could do was
Didn't rip the costume or
didn't read the
something.
costume. You know what? We actually were my team, they were amazing. I had an amazing group of artisans that just did everything they could, and I was really worried that the minute they started wearing them, that we would end up with kind of breakages, and we couldn't get them out quick enough if that happened. So, I
Right.
think we had something like 10 of each, or 6 or 10 of each, but actually they stood up really well, and now I'm going, wow, the choices we made about the stretchy parts, that you can kind of see, and the techniques that we used to stitch them together, because we had to, not only did we have to make hard and soft parts, we had to merge them, so we had to embed fabric in the back of the hard parts that you could then stitch up against. And that was
Wow.
we ended up like altering the machines. We're like cutting the machine foots in half so you could get up to it, and changing our equipment in order to sew them. It was
Wow.
really technical. I think they're probably one of the most difficult superhero costumes we've made so far.
Well, I mean, look, as I said, I thought they looked fantastic, and it's,
Oh, thank
again, it's what I think one of the great strengths of the MCU. People are like, well, they don't look like Jack Kirby's. If you made Icarus look the way Icarus looks on the cover of Eternals 1 in the 70s, people would laugh that off the screen. You
I
have
know.
to make it. And what I love about those costumes is there's a certain timeless regality to them. Is regality a word? They're very
Yes.
they when you see them when they first arrive on Earth, there is this quality, they're otherworldly. The
Yeah.
juxtaposition with those costumes and the bright landscape and the ocean crashing and the deviants and rescuing those, there's something that immediately says, okay, these characters don't belong on Earth, and yet
Yeah.
they are very much royalty. Or it really, there's just something about it that I really love. Now, you mentioned Ivo. Is it Ivo Coveney?
Really. Yeah.
How did you work with him? Did you bring him on to Eternals? Was he working with you?
Yeah, Ivo and I have worked together since I was 19.
Wow.
Um, yeah, we've met in theatre, and then I went and did my degree, and then when I started working with Janty, I knew him, um, obviously from theatre, and knew he did armour and stuff, and so I introduced him to Janty to do Russell Crowe's armour on Gladiator. And then since then, he's done pretty much any film that I've done that is superhero-esque. Or
So you have a shorthand with him.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we've known each other for about 35 years. Yeah, it's do have a shorthand, and he's so techie and he's so artistic at the same time, and it's quite an unusual combination to have. And he knows about all the different, like, 3D printing processes, and so now I can kind of go, you can do this, can't you? And we'll work. He does everything on CAD, and so now I'm starting to kind of understand all that. It's great, but I can't work it, but I can sit with him and we can go. I can say, the collar needs to be higher, or this needs to be lower, or think about this body versus this shape. You kind of work it out from, and all that tech that we have at our hands now, it helps a lot with stuff like this. It's an interesting process, but it's quicker than if you were clay modeling, which takes forever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that the evolution of the digital technology has been a great advantage on particularly whether it's superhero films or science fiction films or things like this, because it allows you to do these kinds of things. Yeah. Now, at the end of Eternals, it says Eternals will return. Now, when you're working on something and knowing that, one of the things I've always loved, especially as a collector of these high-end action figures, I'm like, I wonder how they're going to change the suits. So when you were working on Eternals, did you think of like, now, I guess they don't have to change their suits because it's their technology, but when you're working on stuff, do you ever come up with ideas and think, wow, here's what I want to do for the next iteration? Do you come up with new ideas that you want to implement later? Because, and I ask that because obviously, each Marvel Cinematic Universe movie kind of changes the suits. Like when they did Captain America Winter Soldier, you got the Captain America stealth suit, which was badass. And I'm just thinking, man, I love these Eternal suits so much. I mean, I wouldn't mind if they stayed the same, but did you come up with ideas where you'd evolve the suits if you could?
That was a conversation we were having a lot towards the end of, when you,
because you would learn. I mean, these were difficult suits. Like, how do you make it easier?
And that, obviously, you take that into your next film anyway. That knowledge of like, right now we can do this, and probably some people will cry, my team, about that. But because they're like, not again. But we did talk about how we could make them better as they are. We never had a conversation where there would be another Eternal film, I have to say. I don't know that.
Well, no, but at the end of the movie, it does say the Eternals will return. Just like at the end of a James Bond movie. I'm like, yes.
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 But yes, the knowledge that we have now with those suits, we could definitely make them even better. But, a lot of our work plan gets affected by when you get access to the actor. So you may have loads of time to do R&D, but ultimately when the actor comes in, they, with some of our Eternals, we had to definitely change things in order for it to suit their body. So you have to take on board all those things. So it's great to do concepts, for instance, but there's still the element of actor and the director wanting, actually, maybe we should do it like this. And so another iteration of them, I suppose, it is completely possible. And yes, there are things we wanted to change as we finish, just because we're perfectionists and we want to push that envelope as far as you can. I think that they came out so much better than we anticipated due to our journey of R&D. Now we look at them in the film and go, oh, that line. And yes, of course, but that's more about our purist, kind of want to make it perfect. Yeah.
I gotta ask you too. It's in the trailer. There's a Bollywood scene in the movie.
Yeah.
Now, fun. I was gonna say, and it's not a small scene either. So, like when I'm a fan of Bollywood cinema. When you saw that, was that in the original? Like when you said you read the treatment, was that in the treatment that, oh my God, we get to do a dance number?
I can't remember whether I think that was as we went on and we got a script. I think it got inserted. I don't think it was there in the treatment, but it might have been. I can't remember.
I was because I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, like, because of obviously the Marvel movies do very well in India. I'm curious, did you go and look at any specific Bollywood movies for ideas for costumes?
There were. Do you know what's really interesting? Actually, is Chloe had a certain the House of Flying Daggers. Weirdly, not Bollywood.
Wow. Okay.
There was the colours in that. She really loved
Yeah.
the colours, and she used some film references for colours in all the scenes. And then we did look at Bollywood. There were various Bollywood films we had a look at that we were trying to kind of use as a sort of, is this what you want? Is this what we want? What about this? And in the end, we took all that research, and then we met a Bollywood expert, this lovely lady, and I can't remember off the top of my head what her name was, and she just kind of gave us some guidance in the current Bollywood themes, and then we looked at the House of Flying Daggers, because of that there's a particular scene in it where the lady kind of does this beautiful dance, and we used a lot of the colors in that as reference, and then we decided on color themes for men and women, and a lot of it was inspired by what Kingo is wearing in that scene is Bollywoodized version of Icarus, because
Right.
really
He's playing Icarus. Sure.
Yeah. So we took Icarus's costume and we made a Bollywood version of it. I did a drawing of it, and then we found a beader in India that beaded the center for us, and then we built that all in-house. In fact, everything was built in-house.
I want to actually see that movie.
No, me too.
A movie within a movie. Like, it's a special feature on the 4K disc.
Yeah.
What movie is Kingo making? Here it is. Like, at least give us like 10 minutes of it.
Yeah.
Of the actual finished movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was great to do all that, all the girls in the skirts and the guys and all that color swirling around. That was a real nice light relief, from all the other epochs of, Babylon, and it was already kind of heavy.
Well, I have to say, I mean, the movie really hit me in the right place. It's funny. My review of it, I said that Ridley Scott's Prometheus, which has to do with the engineers creating life on Earth and living through. I'm like, this movie is kind of like if Ridley Scott's Prometheus was told from the engineers' point of view. The people that come to help humanity. And I loved Eternals. I loved the cosmology of it. I loved what it has to say about the Marvel universe, and I was enchanted by the whole thing. I really, because it was kind of a movie that hit me personally in the feels and the kind of things that I like. The idea of ancient. I mean, they keep trying to make movies about ancient astronauts or people influencing the history of humanity, and I'm a huge fan of the original Eternals concept anyway. So I really, really love this movie, and it's interesting to see that the critical response has been mixed. Because I think people are wondering. I think it's going to be a movie that grows in its. It's one of those movies that people are going to love the more they watch it, because there's so much in it. And another thing too is, I don't know if you ever got into this when you were making the movie, but if you're a Marvel Comics fan and you're watching Eternals, there are huge connections to the Avengers, because, like, Cersei's character, she was an Avenger in the Marvel Comics universe. I mean, not in the movie universe, but but who knows what the next Avengers movie is going to be? And I'm like, but it was really interesting from a comics point of view how the Eternals leaves it and where the future could be with those characters. Because I really liked the way those actors all gelled together. I thought they looked great on screen, and I really loved what you all did with that film. I thought it was terrific, and it's great. I guess to wrap up, first of all, I want to thank you for your time. I mean, you were absolutely delightful. I would want to ask, obviously, for people that might want to get into costume design, and if there's a bit of advice, like, what could you tell the next generation of designers who are maybe coming up? Like, I think it was so funny you said you didn't know, you were scared of fashion when you first started. But what can you tell people now? I mean, now we live in an Instagram world where people's designs and everything is all over the internet. How can people begin, and what would you say people should focus on if you want to get into this line of work?
I mean, I think for me, just thinking what's been useful in my career is a love of history, and a love of film. Those two things, because I watched films from such a young age, and now the films I watched when I was, in my early teens or whatever, I didn't realize at the time were like iconic films. But I
What
think,
were some of the films that you talked about Star Wars, but are there other touchstone movies that really impacted you and made you want to design?
yeah, Blade Runner. Yeah,
What's
without
that?
question.
Still,
Yeah,
by the way, a movie whose designs were timeless then, they're timeless now.
I know, and I was very lucky to do some lessons with the person that designed that film, Charles Node. He lectured at Wimbledon for a while, so
Mm.
yeah, um, yeah. What other films? I used to love watching all the Hammer horror movies, and they're really theatrical, and I think I can see why now. They're so kind of like, you know,
Oh, I'm a huge fan. The Karnstein Vampire Trilogy, Vampire
yeah,
Lovers, Lust for a Vampire, and Twins of Evil. Or one of
yeah.
my favorites is Vampire Circus, which is a great. I mean, I'm a huge Hammer horror fan. So
Yeah, loved all those, and I watched those really young, on a Saturday night, double bill, and then also, I really love all the kind of old Good, the Bad, and the Ugly,
yeah.
How the
Well,
Wizard Was.
ponchos. Your love of ponchos. Good,
Yeah,
the bad, the
yeah.
ugly.
I think I kind of there's a definitely, if you look through the thousand films before you die book, I'm in that early 70s. There's all those kind of, movies that I adored, even really random films. There's a film called Danger Diabolique, which I've
Directed
used.
by Mario Bava.
Yeah, and what really great film, really bizarre, but
It's so great. But Danger Diabolic is based on a European comic character.
yeah,
So, like Barbarella and Dino De Laurentiis produced both
yeah,
of those movies.
right. Well,
Danger
there.
Diabolic is awesome. It's awesome.
In fact, I think that was one of the references we used for first Ant-Man.
Really?
Yeah, it was something
Wow.
that I discussed very early on. Was a kind of, the energy of that character, and the kind of what he was wearing was quite funny. But it's that like kind of really simplistic jumpsuit thing.
Yeah.
But there was something about it that I just felt was akin to what we were trying to achieve at the time.
Interesting. I love.
Yeah.
You just became my favorite person doing a Danger Diabolic reference and making Ant-Man. See, that's why you get paid the big bucks. That's why Marvel brings
Oh,
you back, thinking outside the box, knowing your
oh, thank
work.
you. I think that if anybody wants, that's the thing, is like love film. It really is. It's that, and it's also history. And I know a lot of designers don't necessarily do this, but I'm gifted with the fact that I can draw, and therefore I utilize that. And
Mm,
even if you can do it a little bit, because one of the things that um is very obvious when you're making these big movies is that your cutters need a drawing. Even though you might say, "I want something like this, here's the reference," they'll go, "Well,
yep.
what is it?" And you have to draw it, even if it's a line drawing. I like to do line drawings. I like to do full on drawings. Sometimes I'll do bits and pieces and then work it on the stand and then draw it again. But I think that's something that if you want to be a costume designer, try and find a way of getting across your ideas somehow on paper is a good thing for your making team.
Mm,
And research, art, films, history generally. I was Wimbledon School of Art did at the time I went there, did this amazing course where you did the history of style and fashion and politics, all from the history of beginning of time to today. And
wow.
yeah, it was a really good course over the time that I was there. And you need to understand in costume what was happening politically and socially, versus what the style, why fashion was influenced in shape and size and height and color depending on what was going on in the world. That's all, and it affects furniture and architecture and the width of doors and all those kind of things. So it's all a big package, that. So even if you're only doing modern films, it can influence and help you on your journey to characterize.
Well, that makes sense, because one of the things I did like about Eternals is the fact that, well, you call it the fashion, but everything was, from the Eternals standpoint, the Eternals world, all from the Celestials on down, it all was of a piece. It was all the same. You realize that all of the aesthetics with the costumes bled into the technology, bled into where they were from. And I really liked that, because it gave you a sense of reality, that what you were watching, I mean, even though, yeah, when you're dealing with cosmic beings and all that, you could lose the plot and be like, what? But because that there was, everything had sort of a synergy to it, it really felt, that's another thing, that in terms of world building, I really love the world building of the Eternals world in the film, and part of that was because everything worked together.
Yeah. Eve Stewart did a really amazing job, in terms of production design, and we worked quite closely with making sure that colors, in the ship or wherever we were, it worked. There was so much to take in to make sure nothing jarred.
Yeah, and well, I mean, you did a fantastic job, and I hope everyone runs out and sees Eternals, because I thought it was a wonderful movie, and it's a movie I can't wait to see again, because I didn't get to see. I want to go see it on an even bigger screen. I want to go see it at the Chinese. It's opening at the Chinese on Hollywood Boulevard, in IMAX. So I got to go see it there. Yeah. Now, the next thing you have coming up, obviously, is you're still in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, you can't say anything about it. I know, because I have many questions. But I will say this: there's a lot of comic book fans waiting to see a certain, I guess you could call it, antagonist. We met him already in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Loki. He's coming back for me. And if you know your comics, he has many different incarnations, not unlike the Eternals. And I'm very curious to see what's happening there. So I'm very excited.
I love it.
I know. I'm just very excited. Now, can people find you on social media? Do you have an Instagram account?
No. Well, I don't really do social media.
No. Well, can people see your work? Do you have a website where people can look at your design?
No, that's the thing, is I'm really like, I do need to do a website, but I don't currently have one, because I kind of.
Well, it's not like you need people to see your work. It's not like you're,
I know, and I have loads of drawings, and they're just in a drawer. I know. I will make myself a website.
Well, I would say, the one thing about that is the cool thing about websites, at least for me as a fan, when you can go find, especially design work, is it's really inspirational. I was looking at some early work that was done for No Time to Die. There was a designer's website, and it's so cool to see the evolution of things, and to see, if only to honor all the work you've done. I mean, you've worked on, especially because you worked on so many superheroes or science fiction films. We're the people. If I'll give another plug, a shameless plug to Marvel. By the way, I am not a Marvel shill. People are always going, Rob, you're such a Marvel shill. No, Marvel came out with a 2-volume hardcover book, a coffee table book that just came out, called Marvel Studios, and it's the history of Marvel Studios, and the photographs in it are amazing.
It's not the golden age, is it?
No, this is a brand new. It's 2 volumes. It's a beautiful hardcover book, and I'll plug it. I'm not getting paid for this. I'm not getting paid to pimp out Marvels, but it's a really cool book with loads of behind the scenes photos.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
It's really, really cool, and it's $150, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
Buy that book. Well, listen, Sammy Differ, I want to thank you so much for appearing on this podcast. I mean, what a delightful time we've had. I could talk to you for another 4 hours, but I'm sure they'd be like, one day I'm going to get you to spill something and you're not supposed to say it. So the sooner we get off this call, the safer you are. But congratulations on Eternals, and we will be looking forward to anything you do in the future. I mean, your work has been really inspiring and exemplary, and I think you've done a lot to further the cause of great genre costume design. I mean, everything you've worked on, and I would encourage everyone, if you haven't gone back to see movies like Stardust, what a wonderful movie, a movie that I think doesn't get enough credit, And it's just a really great piece of work. And of course, go see Eternals. It's in the theaters. This podcast drops on Friday when the movie is actually released, and go see it on a big screen because it's great. And then we'll be waiting eagerly. I mean, we have to wait till 2023 to see Quantum Mania?
Yeah.
Oh well, what are you gonna do? Good things come to those who wait, I guess. Well, Sammy, thank you so much for being here, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to meet you.
It was great to meet you. Well, that certainly was another terrific episode of the Designing Hollywood podcast. I want to thank our sponsor, Fox Studios Costumes. With an extensive array of costumes and textiles from all eras, the Fox On-Lot Warehouse provides costumers an opportunity to turn their ideas into works of art. I want to thank our guest, Sammy Differ. Was she not amazing? My God, I thought I was going to geek out harder than I did, but luckily I kept it under control. I especially want to thank our producer and founder, Martika Ibarra, and the co-founder, the legendary costume designer, Marilyn Vance. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to iTunes. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or watch the YouTube version. Once again, my name is Robert Meyer Burnett, your host, and you can follow me on all across social media at Instagram at Robert Meyer Burnett, Twitter at BurnettRM, or find me on my own YouTube channel, The Burnett Work. Thanks for watching. We very much appreciate it.